Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Good Tech Fest Data and Governance Half Day event hosted by data analysts for social good and sponsored by Bright Hive. I'm glad you all could join us today. In our keynote today, the panelists will explore a future in which trusted data sharing allows for new forms of online services for individuals and communities. The possibilities seem endless, but what types of data governance practices are needed to ensure this future includes responsible data collection and sharing and a commitment to protecting individual privacy? Our moderator, Natalie Evans-Harris, will kick it off and we will close with a Q&A, so please post your questions in the chat. Go ahead.
Thank you, Brittany, and hello, everyone. It's always weird in these situations because I like to see faces. So if things are great, give me a wave. Let me know something. I like feedback. If you're sleepy, just nod off on the keyboard. It's fine. Welcome. Today, we're going to be talking about data governance and privacy, but we're really focused on how is it an enabler for data to truly be used to solve some of our social sector problems, in particular as we start to see more and more of our lives be on the internet and our data become representations of us, whether accurate or not, in making decisions around social services. This question of how are we using data responsibly, and especially during times of pandemic, using it rapidly, become all that more important. So what we're going to do today with this esteemed panel of colleagues is really talk about what does it look like today to use data responsibly, and what does a data-driven future state actually look like? I'll share some of my thoughts, but really we're here to hear from and learn from Brenda, Nancy, and Taylor and their varied backgrounds. So next slide, Sam. And Sam is also on the call and supporting me with slides and notes and calling people in the chat and all of those things. So who am I? I'm Natalie Evans-Harris. I truly, at the core of me and everything that I do, is really centered around this belief that we as people can, through our collective power, make data the transforming tool that we believe it to be. Data by itself can't solve these problems, but if we bring our human collective capacity together, we can use data to truly do amazing things to improve the human experience. And you'll see my work throughout. I worked under the Obama administration as a senior policy advisor. I worked on the Hill as a tech legislator, and I worked for the National Security Agency and throughout the federal government, all centered around responsible use of data. Started as a coder, realized that I'd rather talk about it than be about it, and have been talking about it ever since. Next slide. So what are we going to do today? When it comes to thinking about data governance and privacy, we're really going to spend today talking about where are we today and where do we want to go? And then the majority of the conversation with the panel is really going to be centered around how do we get there? So if we have a vision for where we want to go, there's all different paths to get there. And as you'll hear from some of these slides, it's a very complex, siloed situation in and of itself. So how do we start to break down some of these barriers and really move this conversation forward and really start to build that national community that's imperative for this work to be successful. Next slide. So let's start off with a couple definitions. When we talk about data governance, we're really talking about the collection of practices and processes that describe how we use data. How are decisions made? How is it monitored? And how are we enforcing those decisions? Data governance often gets to a very technical level, but at the heart of it, it's really around the people and how are we using data and what are we using it for and how are we protecting those that we seek to serve while we're using their data to make these decisions. And next slide. And when we think about privacy, what we're really thinking about is another set of another set of practices and processes centered around protecting individuals' data from unauthorized use, access, and disclosure. So what are the governance pieces that dictate and guide how we use data? And then within that, what are the practices and processes that we're putting in place to protect people through those governance practices. It's important to realize both because we want to make sure that we take a user-centered and driven approach to how we do this work. And by remembering that they're two separate things that are brought together, it really helps us to build our governance from a people perspective. Go ahead, next slide, Sam. So let's think about our world today. I don't think we have to have a conversation around, do we need data? Is data valuable? Can it do really cool things? I think we understand the value of data and what it could do both for people, communities, organizations worldwide. But we're also recognizing that it's really hard to do because of barriers, both technical and cultural. We sit in an infrastructure where silos are encouraged because that is how you protect, by limiting access. But there's this tension with that because limiting access also means limiting opportunities in many situations with the way that it's been applied. So how do we start to transform our policies, increase our interoperability, improve our standards so that we're breaking down silos while still protecting people's privacy and security? And literacy around this. We talk about we want self-sovereignty. We talk about we want people to make decisions around their data, are even willing to pay them to do so. But what education do they have in making that decision? How do they know, other than I don't want bad things to happen to me, whether to say yes or no to their data being used in certain situations? And that not just applies at the people level, but in all levels of data and interactions and transactions. So let's go on to the next slide. So what we're living in is a world where everybody wants to use data and get answers, but then we're not confident in what we get because we're not confident in the infrastructure that has delivered that. In my NSA world, in the intelligence community, we used to call that pulling the thread. So you can have a decision on one end, but you need to be able to pull that thread, pull that needle all the way through if you want to have confidence and be able to use that information. That's really hard to do with the infrastructure and the ecosystems that we have set up today. Go to the next slide. But what we do want is a world where data is used that in a coordinated fashion, where everybody is aware, everybody has the data that they need when they need it in a way that is usable. It's coordinated. And it's empowering, right? So it's not just the company that collected the data that has all the power, but it's also the individuals who the data is about. It's about the government entities who are making decisions around what is and is not allowed about the data. So there's this empowerment element that really means we need to empower all the different stakeholders, not just the collector of the data, which is the world that we live in today. And it has to be sustainable. We need infrastructures and ecosystems that don't just talk about what we need today, but allow for change because the world changes and shouldn't require millions of dollars and hundreds of hours of policy time in order to make those changes. It's a society that's equal, where everybody brings to bear their powers and their intellect and their capabilities to run this system and this digital world. Go to the next slide. So it's a world that kind of looks like this. It's a public-private citizen collaboration. It means developing ecosystems where data-driven social services are a norm and not this piecemeal thing that has to be fit in. It's investing in the infrastructure that allows for data to be used in these coordinated, empowering, and sustainable ways. And what I didn't touch on as much in previous slides, but is imperative through all this, it's building trust within our communities, right? Because we can build the greatest thing and they won't come because they don't trust. We've seen that with the contact tracing apps and world that we live in now, where we need this data from individuals and individuals aren't comfortable reporting it for a variety of reasons that all fit into this need to be able to make accessing data possible through the infrastructure, to make defining value in the hands of the people and driving impact, a collective, collaborative ecosystem of varied skills and diverse thought. So that's my vision of the world. It's a world where we all get to play with data nicely and friendly, and amazing things happen because we've all come together to do it. Go to the next slide. And there's an ethical piece to this, right? If you want to build trust, you need to make sure that when you're sharing data, you're transparent and open, and it has informed consent, informed being the key, and it's cooperative and flexible. These are all the components where if we do it right, we have more positive data-driven innovations and a digital world where people are interacting and a voice in the system. Next slide. So that's what's needed to build trust, right? It's balancing these individual rights with our need for digital services. It's what we hear when we talk about the one-stop shops of somebody going to the government through one door and being able to have all of their holistic needs met and not being told, oh no, you have to go through these 4 other doors because we can't access them. It's a more holistic approach to a digital world that we need, where we're empowering people to use data, establishing the processes, governance, to clarify those practices, and leveraging technology to build the infrastructure that holds us accountable. My favorite quote is at the bottom of this slide. It's about defining a common good and beginning again to shape a common future. It's from Representative Barbara Charlene Jordan from Texas, also first Black woman to speak and give the keynote address at the Democratic National Convention. And she spoke on a lot of these same topics that we struggle with today. How do we use technology for good? How do we use data and technology in a way that serves people and eliminates many of these barriers? I'm gonna stop there because I've spoken, I think, longer than I expected to. And I'd love to take some time to introduce these panelists. I'll start with Brenda because you're right next to me on the screen. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your work at Future Privacy Forum, and what's your vision of the future in a digital world that's successful?
Well, I really like your vision. That's something we can even get close to someday, because that would be a really lovely place to live. I'm Brenda Leong, and I work at the Future of Privacy Forum, which is a nonprofit think tank in Washington, D.C., focused on responsible data practices for emerging technologies, and focused on privacy protections, but ethical considerations and general governance levels of responsibility for our data. I'm the Senior Policy Counsel and Director for AI and Ethics at FPF. And so the work I do is very directly tied to what we're talking about today, which is figuring out how these technologies empower and enable us and how to leverage that to the greatest extent, while of course identifying the many risks and pitfalls and challenges, and how to mitigate those or control those either through legislation or policy and industry standards, or whatever other practices that might be on behalf of advocates and consumer protection and whatever avenue those might take. So I think we were asked to sort of focus our vision of the future around the concept of a digital identity aspect of how our data might work in that way. And I think that's a really useful way of focusing on the future and that future state we might end up in. I think the biggest shift to a digital identity, and I'm talking here more about than just the fact that we are online and of course have a digital identity in the sense that we have these data trails behind us, but the formalized version of how we would actually authenticate our identity online in a legal, credible, commercial way, is that we're going to have to develop some sort of middleman role in that case, even if it's just the platform or service that provides it. So a lot of the conversation goes and is going to go today, I think, around the government being behind, or the role of government being behind this digital identity authentication. And obviously I think government has a role to play there, but in contrast to today, where they give you a physical piece of paper as a birth certificate or a driver's license or something like that through their own personnel agency output, we're now going to have some kind of middleman technology platform because of the data aspects. And so that's going to be, I think, a huge shift in terms of how we think about the security, the access, the sharing of data, the control of the data, and the transition if, for example, those middlemen contracts shift from one provider to another over time, and things like that. the benefits of that could be that we can actually limit data sharing to what's actually needed for the authentication process. I think many people are probably most familiar with the example of, like, you know, you're trying to enter a over 21 establishment, and right now you show your physical license at the door, so they see your name, your address, and your actual birth date, none of which they need. They just need some sort of authentication from a trusted source that says you are over 21 and you can be let in. And that's it. They don't need the date of when you turn 21 or any other piece of information about you. And this is the model that can make that happen. So there certainly are benefits to how we can use this digital identity, but of course that data still resides somewhere, and the access and control over it, particularly in cultures or countries with perhaps less developed civil rights protections or less developed democratic processes to protect individual rights under those regimes, leads to a lot of concerns about that. So I know we're going to talk more about that today, so I'll kind of leave it there. There's the legal aspect for the government to provide, and then there's the actual day-to-day commercial interactions that we have where we need this authentication ability, and how to make that happen at a technical level. So my short answer to that, in terms of a lot of the things that come into this conversation over time, is I would be on the yes to some kind of biometrics as part of this authentication, and I would be no to the question of blockchain as part of this solution. So that's where I fall on those spectrums, and we can engage on those as we go today.
I feel like we could have a whole nother panel session on blockchain versus biometrics. But it'll be really interesting today to especially touch on digital IDs and the government's role in enforcing those as maybe a national standard, and what that means for digital divides and indigenous communities where that might not be as accessible as it would be in other parts of this nation. Let's go to Nancy Smith, who is with, forgive me, Nancy, Data
Smith Solutions.
Data Smith Solutions. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your vision of a future state, and digital IDs in that world.
So thank you for having me, and I love everything I've heard so far. I could just listen to you all for the rest of the day, I think. My experience is primarily K-12 education. The last decade or so, I've also worked with higher education, but also the whole preschool through P20W, preschool through post-secondary and workforce. So I mostly work with state agencies. Early in my career, in the 90s, the 20th century, I actually worked at the Texas Education Agency as a researcher analyst. And that is always my thinking around when I visualize data sets. How am I going to analyze it? How am I going to turn it into information? And how do we govern those data sets, getting the data, producing the reports, doing the analysis? After a period at TEA, I worked for a nonprofit that started using data from multiple states to create student level data, to create school improvement reports. I co-founded the Data Quality Campaign, did a stint at the US Department of Ed over the statewide longitudinal data system grant program, and started the initiatives for common education data standards and privacy technical assistance, but that was just, I left before that got up and running. For the past decade, I've done a lot of consulting on analysis, needs assessment, a whole lot of helping organizations, state government entities, stand up data governance programs. So actually a whole lot of my work is helping them understand what a governance program does, how it works, and not even getting to the point of seeing it working. And then the last year and a half, I was at the EdFi Alliance working on trying to get teacher prep programs to implement the EdFi data standard for data interoperability, to make use of all of their data sources for continuous improvement. And so, you know, I keep touching data standards and interoperability. My vision for the future, I'm not even sure I can articulate it, because right now I feel kind of stuck in the tension between the users, now that we've all got these smartphones and we want whatever data we want in our hands in a second, whether we know how to make sense of it or use it or not, we want it available. And then the tension of working with state education agencies or higher ed, sometimes districts, whose purpose isn't big data to make it available yet on demand. So there's just a natural tension. Do the state and federal government data systems absolutely need to become more nimble and more data aware and data user savvy and data sharing or data open, whatever words you want, instead of compliance and reactive oriented? We definitely need to be more proactive. I often talk about the difference between data and information. We're collecting numbers and letters. We need to turn it into actionable information. And I feel like one of the middlemen, besides, going from technology to user, one of the middlemen then needs to be for education data, and that's my background, is education data, is the middleman of the data coaches, or what we're now calling data literacy. How do we get people to really use the information that's provided in reports and turn it into changed behavior in the classroom or instruction? I don't know how to do that. I can analyze the heck out of the data and I can produce a whole lot of pretty reports. Never been a teacher. So turning that into improved student outcomes is another skill set that we often don't include in these conversations around technology or data governance or data management. I do think that we're at a kind of at an inflection point of how do we get government education agencies to change their service model or add to their mission of being informed, providing useful information to improve outcomes, as opposed to using technology just to collect what's mandated, and then sometimes occasionally using it for helpful reports. I think there's just a natural tension right now, and we can build on the opportunity if we engage all the right people.
Yeah, what's interesting about the education space in particular is because there's a plethora of data available. It's collected. There's a there's more. It's a ridiculous amount of data almost, and there's a resistance of the people in actually using the data. So they want all the data, want it collected, and that's government, school districts.
Yeah.
Name it. Everybody's collecting data about our education and our students, but then when it's time to create digital tools and get it used, this resistance makes it very difficult to be user-centered.
Absolutely. We want to protect the kids to a degree. I get it, but we also want to help the kids. I will also say just flat out funding and capacity. There's just resources and capacity issues, even if we got all the leadership ready to rock it for the next step. Mm-hmm. We haven't funded it yet.
Yeah. So lots to talk about in that space of just people and trust and funding to make things happen, where data is actually not the issue. And then our third panelist, I'm happy to welcome Taylor Campbell, who is with us from the Beck Center at Georgetown. Taylor, go ahead and introduce yourself. Tell us about your future state in a digital world, and then we'll jump into questions.
Sure. Thank you so much, Natalie. My name is Taylor Campbell. As Natalie mentioned, I am the Deputy Director of Data and Digital at Georgetown's Beck Center for Social Impact and Innovation, which is basically a long way of saying that I work with really brilliant researchers and practitioners who are working to improve data and digital spaces and workflows in government, which is very exciting to me. It's what I live for. I personally have a previous experience in government technology, working as the Deputy Director of Tech and Innovation for the City of Los Angeles. advising elected leadership on how we might be more tech-based and be better with our data governance, and respectful of the people that we are positioned to serve. Prior to that, prior to that, I worked at the White House under President Obama as a systems developer, and I managed the database that powered all things at the White House. And that was where I really learned a lot about the importance of data. My job was specifically focusing on the data that came in from constituents as they wrote letters or made phone calls to the president. And that was a fascinating experience because it showed me just the range of what data really is. As Nancy mentioned, I love that data is information. When I realized that was the definition, my mind was like, oh my gosh, it's just information. There's so much we can do with information. Sometimes we think about data as like this big, weird, distant thing if we're not that familiar with it. But thinking about it as information has been really helpful for me. And when I think about my vision, I think about how, I've always seen data and technology as a means to an end. And so then, begs the question, what information do I need in order to achieve X? And one thing that I always try to focus on also is how might I get that information? Acknowledging that the processes by which we get information, sometimes, people aren't comfortable with, or sometimes it leaves people in the dark, including myself. I personally have experienced that. And so my vision is for a good world, as you mentioned, Natalie, and my vision is for a good world that does good. And to me, good is rooted in compassion and respect for the person, for the user, first and foremost. So, we talk about government. I think when I think of government, I think of public service. And I think about public service to real people, real people, not just constituents, but the people who work in government too are real people, regular people. And, government is not just like this monster in the distance. It's a bunch of people who are trying to do good things. And I think that, being able to recognize that and not only recognize it, but respect it, and dare I say celebrate it, and celebrate the range of identities that, when we talk about digital identity, the range of identities that come with America and, who lives here. And as we develop tools and practices and technologies that represent people, that they are reflective of that diversity of identity that does exist, and that we respect that range of preferences and that we design for that.
I love it. So you're on the people side. You're like, let's build that trust, then great things can happen. Right. So I'm going to ask a couple questions of the panel, and then I already see some questions showing up in chat. So I'll go back and forth. And also, ladies, if there's something I'm not asking that you want to make sure you talk about, just holler and let's do this, okay? I want to make this as conversational as possible. So let's start with this move towards digital services and a verified form of online identity. We inevitably encounter privacy challenges as we make this move towards digital services and online identity. And as we're thinking about some of those challenges, Brenda, you brought this up in your initial comments. What are some of those privacy concerns from having a single online ID that is controlled by the government?
So, I mean, realistically, the government is the single provider most likely to confer some sort of identity with like a legal authority behind it. And it's in the best position to sort of address the broad question of how to implement this generally. But it doesn't mean that the government has to be the only authenticator or provider of identity in an online exchange in every situation. I think it's always helpful, I think, to compare to the systems that we have now when we're talking about what's going to be different on a digital platform, whether it's better, whether it's worse, whether it has different risks, whatever that might be. So, I mean, in the US, we're one of the few countries that doesn't have a national ID right now. We have some de facto things. We have our social security number and we have our driver's license, which of course has at the moment multiple different issuers because it's at the state level. But we have sort of de facto standards of ID, and with the Real ID Act and with passports, we effectively have federal level control over sort of an ultimate ID that we can use in almost any case. But then of course we have commercial identification verification opportunities as well. You can log on to a lot of things with Google or Facebook. You can pay for a lot of things against a credit card or a bank account without sharing that data directly by using Apple Pay or Google Pay. So the commercial industry has already come up with a lot of practical applications to make that usable and fairly frictionless for many people. The question is, how does that impact people that maybe don't have access, are less in the banked community, have less access to financial services generally, maybe just to technology, and how are they supported as well? And then of course, the bigger question is when you take it out of the US and look at it as a global question, which is really what we need to be doing since all the companies operate globally and most of us live, even if we don't leave home per se, especially right now, we sort of live globally in the sense that we have connections and hopefully one day again travel and other interactions around the world as to how to provide that. So I think the government is the right place to sort of center that or be the core of it, especially in that legal, credible standard. But then of course that does open up questions about the access that they hold. What do they do with it? You mentioned earlier, Natalie, the idea of wanting to be able to sort of go in one door and have multiple things available to you. And obviously that would be really convenient and nice as a user when you want the government to provide you services and that's what you're there for. But at the same time, there are certainly scenarios where you would not in fact want multiple government agencies to share your data across them. And you would not want that as the de facto rule that every agency had access to all of your data anytime they wanted it. You want to have some control over when they share that data and how that's used about you. So those kind of protections, which have to come via practice and legislation and policy, they're not going to be implemented technologically necessarily, are going to be important.
That's a really good point. And yes, I love a world where everything is shared, but you're absolutely correct that we can all come up with 3 scenarios on our own where we should probably make it harder to share data and really intentional about what we're sharing and why. Nancy, I'd love your perspective on similar question, response to what Brenda said, but really from the K-12 children's online privacy lens, because there's some nuances to that, separate from just making it accessible to do things online, but also making sure that they're not minors and not minors doing things that minors shouldn't be doing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have a written response, but what you just said made me think of something. As COVID started, developers, the shift in education was, well, how do we track engagement online with remote learning rather than in-person seat attendance, which is how education is funded to a large degree. How do you assess engagement? And so developers are saying, well, we can track, when kids are online, what websites they're visiting, or are they in the class, or, things like that. And immediately red flags go up. What if they're on websites they shouldn't be? Does the school get access to that? Do the parents find out? There are just so many red flags that could come up with each type of action. And that to me is why governance, the process of governance in agencies, schools, districts, state is so important. I think somebody else said it earlier. To me, governance, I think of it basically as process management. We're going to do this process. Who's responsible? What if somebody blows it up? What if somebody does something unintended? What if there's unintended consequences? Then what do we do? Then who does what? What are the roles and responsibilities? What committees do you have? Nobody wants another committee to sit on. My passionate view is that governance is standard operating practices that brings legal, ethical, technological support to using information, again, to improve, whether it's improve the state agency, improve student outcomes, whatever. We need process management. And just like with a lot of technology, we don't see that we fund that so much in education. A lot of people say, if it's data, then it's the IT shops, their job. A lot of people, I swear to God, a lot of people think data is a 4-letter word. I don't know, but it's not the IT people's job. The IT people are like, I don't own the data. I don't know the context. I've just got the mechanism to collect it, store it, report it. We don't get those two sets of like cousins together on Thanksgiving Day to figure out a good meal for the whole family. It's really hard to get the users, the researchers and policy people and the IT people in the same room to come up with a coherent strategy and practice. But if you want to protect the privacy of kids, whether it's the most vulnerable or not, anybody, if you want to protect the privacy of the adults and still find a way to use information, we have to give space, and not just space, but senior leadership has to expect governance, active participation, active strategy, planning, mitigation of risks. And state agencies in my experiences have been doing that. There's certainly some P20W agencies. I don't know how much it is at schools and districts, hopefully certainly bigger districts, but what about smaller schools and districts where the principal is the bus driver and the IT person and doesn't have time to come up with policy or document practice? How do we get a collective or a collaborative approach to governance to help the small, medium, rural, other types? And I'm sure this applies in every industry. How do we make this a standard expectation and practice to protect the privacy and security and protect the confidentiality? Because not everything's going to be anonymous. A lot of reports have to go out and there's a lot of masking of data, and I'll get to this later. As a researcher, I don't want masking of data that comes to me. I want the whole data set, but researchers have to, respect the confidentiality and privacy on the reports that go out so that we can effectively use it. But to me, this is a governance conference, so I'm not going to feel guilty saying we need governance over and over, but it really comes to the human practice, the ethical practice, and just the focus and intention to work through these processes to protect everyone and still find useful information.
+1 to everything you just said, especially when you're thinking about school districts and making sure that everybody's at the table. So it's not just your IT people. You do need to involve parents in the conversation. You do need to involve administrators and teachers and everybody in the conversation to really have an effective governance process put in place. But that also, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say that sometimes I'll just pick on state agencies. They might have everyone in their agency at the table. But if you don't include the LEA or school folks, either technical or policy, then you don't understand. You have no way of finding out if what you've written has unintended consequences or how it's going to be interpreted. Same thing with the LEA and parents or students or the campus representatives. You really need broad engagement just to make sure that everyone understands the policy and what you've written.
Yeah, and Taylor in her opening comments also talked a lot about that engagement and the importance of people being involved. I'd love to hear your thoughts, Taylor's thoughts, Brenda's thoughts. What happens when somebody opts out? So you've got a great data-driven solution. You have this awesome idea for being able to use data to drive outcomes and solve really hard problems. And parents say, no, you can't use my kid's data. Or Medicaid recipients say, no, I don't want my data being used in this way. So there's this risk, right, associated with wanting it to be a collaborative and fully engaged process. That the risk is that research and innovation might also be hurt by people not trusting or not being willing to actually engage and participate in the ways that we need. Taylor, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think I personally can identify with moments where I, speaking for myself, didn't feel comfortable sharing my data. And I think there's definitely some validity to that that needs to be taken into account. There's no silver bullet, unfortunately, to getting people to share their data. But I do think that at a minimum, recognizing what people's concerns are, and actually listening is very important and not happening enough, in my opinion. And being able to design for approaches that actually address people's concerns, which means taking time to hear them out. It makes me think of, it's not a digital identity challenge, but it makes me think of the census. Shout out to the census, still going. Take it if you haven't. 10 questions, 10 minutes. But it makes me think of the census and how, there was a very real concerns, very valid concerns among people that I know personally about, like, no, I don't want to give my information away in this way because it might threaten my safety or my security. And there's a risk in that. There's always a risk in that. And so I think the burden is on our institutions. I really agree with what Nancy was saying, and I think that our burden is also on our institutions to support our schools. But coming back to census, I think the burden is on our institutions to make, first of all, hear what the concerns are, and to think holistically about how those concerns might be taken into consideration. Oftentimes, we see examples of we'll just do it anyway, and you can either get with us or get lost, and that never goes well. And so I think my thought generally is just thinking about how we might design for the challenges that are occurring, not just at the institutional level, but at the individual level as well.
Thank you. Any other thoughts before we go on to the next topic? All right, so I'm going to ask this one last question and then we're going to open it up to the audience. We're going to shift gears a little bit. And when we think about what data and tech can do for us in the future and look at where we're currently at, most of us here today likely feel an immediate gap. It's going to take a lot of innovation and careful thinking about governance and privacy to get us there. So let's start talking about some of the potential tools that can lead us into this new future. New tools related to training, technology, support services, anything you guys can think of that are needed to support moving towards a positive digital future. And I'm opening this up to all of you. What are some thoughts on tools? You can even use the word blockchain, Brenda. What are some thoughts on tools that'll help us move towards a digital future that has the infrastructure, the people, processes, privacy, all of the things that we need to be successful in a digital world?
Well, I'll jump in to start, and I'll use another term that many people might be as antithetical to as I am to blockchain, which is to say things like artificial intelligence and machine learning, which we didn't get a chance to talk about yet, but they provide sort of a next level of analysis, of computation, of opportunity, that this data that we're talking about being collected can enable, once we hit the era of big data, once we had more powerful computational systems. And, I think there is a lot of opportunity and benefit there, but of course we are all, I think probably in this community or this session today, attending or speaking, aware of the many challenges that we've already seen in many of those systems because of the way they're designed, either using historical data or because they reflect human processes as they exist now, which already embody human biases, and then those can be carried over into the model building for AI systems, that these are not an easy fix. This is not a silver bullet that can come in and do things for us better, faster, more fairly, anything like that. But I think they have the opportunity to do that. Like there is the potential to provide those kind of improvements and make things better. Our systems right now are not perfect. They're far from perfect. And so to the extent that we can use the data to understand where things are unfair now, where the inequities exist, and create the models, build the systems to counter that, to account for that, to try to overcome that, or even to help us in our search for that, I think there is real opportunity there to use these very complex programs of the future to help us reach that state. But it's not going to be fast or easy, and it's going to take a lot of, very careful thought and oversight and iterations to make it effective and to make it work. But I think those are some of the technologies that we will find really necessary as we move forward.
What do you see as, because AI is a good example of a tool with a lot of potential, as a technology with a lot of potential. What do you see as like the pick one gap in our ability to realize that potential for AI? Because it's turbulent, right? AI is great, but AI is also not so great for Black people. So what what is that one thing that we should put all of our energy towards focusing on over the next year in order to make it so that AI is a tool that is beneficial for everybody?
I think that, I don't know if this is really a gap, but I think that we should be willing to slow down a little bit. I think that we need to take the time to understand, like we've been so excited with what machine learning can do faster or at greater scale than we've been able to do prior to that, even with computerized systems, that we've kind of developed them and implemented them all at once. And then we're starting to see them fail and to see where the problems are. And I think if we were to take that a little slower and maybe implement them in places where the risks are a little less, like your movie recommendations based on AI algorithm, output, if that goes wrong, the impact on my life today is a lot different than if I'm using it in the criminal justice system for bail recommendations. So let's not do that yet. Let's not do that until we test it on some of these lower risk environments to find out how they work, to figure out how to audit them effectively. People talk a lot about transparency and accountability of these systems, and it's not going to look the way that it does for traditional systems. We can't just open that black box and look inside to figure it out. So we have to develop the systems and tools to test the systems and monitor the systems to make sure that they're actually doing what we want them to do. And I think if we're a little less excited about how amazing some of these things can be or might be, and a little bit more cautious about how we put them into our actual day-to-day lives and services, that maybe will cause a little less harm along the way as we still seek to get to that better future where they in fact enable us and do good things for us in that way.
Yeah, probably the best advice to give around innovation is slow down. Slow down to speed up. Nancy, Taylor, any thoughts from you on tools critical to moving towards this future state?
Yeah, if I can jump in. I really like what Brenda said, and it reminds me of the data drills that we're doing out of the Beck Center. So we have identified, one of our brilliant fellows, Amin Ra Mashariki, has identified that, like emergency drills, it might be a good idea to do data drills when things are calm, not when the emergency is actually upon us. We learned a lot of lessons from COVID-19. One of the realizations out of COVID-19 is that the data that exists might inherently hold biases against communities of color or marginal communities, and being able to run a drill during time of calm really gives people who own or who interact with that data the opportunity to identify gaps and opportunities and biases and limitations and opportunities while the iron is cold, and being able to think through those challenges and think through those opportunities in a very real, or as real as you can get, right? Because not all of the factors can be predicted when it comes to a crisis, but we can learn a lot from history. We can learn a lot from what has happened. So I think about how data drills are a tool that might be even adapted into different scenarios and different spaces, like a school system, like a home, and thinking about how a lot of times we want to, step up to the plate when it's almost too late, and how we might be able to be proactive because we know enough about technology by now. We know what we needed to do to respond to COVID, which was massive. So we have a pretty good proxy for what we might need to do in the future. And I want to also give a special shout out to another one of our fellows, Erica Seth Davies. And she talked about how bias informs decision-making, and decision-making becomes policy and practice. And policy and practice has the potential to reinforce and perpetuate bias. And so as we think about those drills or whatever practices and trainings and techniques we're employing, we have to be mindful of those aspects of it. Otherwise, we're building and continuing to design solutions or design approaches that will perpetuate the challenges that inevitably show themselves, especially when things get really hard.
So true. And it buttresses Brenda's point around slowing down, because one of the reasons why we want to slow down and not apply AI to things like bail decisions is because of the practices that have been put in place that have inherent biases in them that AI just scales and exacerbates. Thank you very much. So excellent points. And I love the idea of data drills. It's like creating muscle memory around good data practices. Nancy?
Yeah, one thing that's been spoken of in education for probably a decade is the need for or desire for student digital backpacks. Kind of like health records, which I've realized I don't have my own health records. I need to look into that. But students or parents having their records and being able to share it if they change schools or districts. One of the big things that I've heard about lately is, at least in Texas, a big challenge for high schoolers to send their transcript to multiple colleges, particularly first generation college students who don't have a parent who can help them through the process, and counselors have so many kids. And there's steps, and they think they've followed the steps, but the technology somehow there's a gap. And, or they may send a PDF, and then the colleges don't have an electronic record. They have somebody translating the PDF into their record. It's just so time consuming, but literally there are kids who do not enroll in college that first fall semester because their transcript didn't get there. In the 21st century with our technology, that feels unconscionable. That's amazing to me. So maybe some concept of a digital student backpack where we do empower students through their phone or a computer at home if they have the technology and internet. And yet there are still needs for the district and the state to have student records as well for all of their purposes, their reporting, their analysis, their research. It's not one or the other, but to some of the other questions, how do we empower students and their parents? In my mind, I'm also like, how much do they really want to take on managing their own data? And will they know what to do with it? And I don't mean to disparage them, but what do you do with it? How do you interpret it? Or is it just enabling them to better share data as they move around? There's so many things to unpack, but yes, you know, in education, it doesn't work to leave everything in the hands of schools, districts, or states. What are either the intermediary parties, or what can parents and students manage better on their own? I think we need to explore that. There's been a lot of conversation. I don't think that there's been funding. I'm not sure why it hasn't happened in the decade I've heard about it. Yeah, I guess there's not a push or funding or something, but I do wonder if that's kind of our next level, next tool.
So we're starting to get questions in the Q&A, so I'm just going to start reading them off, and then we can jump back into the questions I have if there's time at the end. So question for Nancy, would you mind providing, and this is from Winnie Lee, would you mind providing examples for states that have developed or are developing viable policies and data standards for data interoperability? So do you have examples of states?
Well, in terms of data standards, there are a few companies or organizations that have provided data standards, and so states may not necessarily be developing their own standard, like for their P20W. The Common Education Data Standards is sponsored by the U.S. Department of Education, and it does have data elements going from preschool into workforce, I believe, through post-secondary. And states, there are states that are mapping to or aligning to that. I believe CEDS has also built a data warehouse that use it, you know, that you can align to and so help with reporting. The EdFi Alliance, where I used to work, is predominantly K-12 and 8-9 years old. They have developed a data standard in K-12 to help with interoperability, and there's I don't know, 6 to 10 states that have or are implementing it, but more importantly, there's over 800 districts that have implemented, because districts actually have a lot more apps than the state education agency does. And then there are other organizations. IMS Global has some data standards. And so before you develop your own standards, check to see if there's something out there that meets your needs, your particular purposes. And then I would also, I have to give this caveat or caution, make sure what you're looking for is data interoperability and not integration. Sometimes integrating data sets will be sufficient, especially if you have good programmer analysts like Taylor and her staff, like I used to be, where we can take data from a lot of sources. And you don't have to automate everything, is what I'm going to say. Sometimes researchers, analysts can do a whole lot for you. And integrated data sets like K-12, post-secondary workforce, they can be integrated. They don't have to technically be interoperable. I think we sometimes pick terms and other options might be available.
Really good point. Second question, also from Winnie Lee. This one's for Brenda. If we use machine learning algorithms to match or link administrative data for the purpose of interoperability, what kind of AI biases would you expect? Ooh, that's a good one.
A lot in that question.
Yeah.
A really good question. So first, I'm a lawyer, not a computer scientist, so please take anything that I say on the technical side with a grain of salt. But I think part of the inherent assumption of that question is, if we knew what kind of bias to expect, it would be a lot easier not to have it. So part of the problem is the bias that we're not looking for. So most good faith, reputable systems, which I'm going to attribute to the vast majority of industry and stakeholders, are are attempting to at least do like compliance level bias checks. So things like protected classes and known discriminatory factors and socioeconomic status and things like that. And they're going to try to check for that. That doesn't mean they all do, or it doesn't mean they all find it, and things like that. It's not like that's easy, but that is something. Those are the expected biases that people know that they're going to have to search for. And so some of the problem is that we don't know what the biases might look like or might be, although those are always good places to start. The other, I think, ways to do this in a safer way when you're talking about shifting something over to a machine learning system and linking data is to not link all the data into all one system or data set or process, but to do it in subsets so that you can kind of see, are you getting different outcomes? I mean, if you're just talking about one or two things, like, I don't know the exact context of your question, like, linking schools within a district and there's just not that many, maybe it's not as easy to sort of do several subgroups of that, but something along those lines, there are ways to try to monitor what's happening and compare and contrast outputs of different systems at different times. And then finally, like I said at the beginning, one of the best ways is to look at what is happening now in a non-digital or non-AI driven system and see where the weak points are. We know resources are not divided among schools or school systems equitably because of the way schools are funded and because of the way resources are distributed. We know teacher qualifications are different. We know some school districts have higher transient populations of turnover for both students and staff. So those kinds of things that we already know are inequities or stressors in the systems are the same things that we should be looking for when we shift over to a machine learning based process to see if are they getting worse? Are they being highlighted better so that we can maybe address them more efficiently? What is the impact there? But the underlying problems are already underlying problems in many cases, and automating them doesn't necessarily make them go away and doesn't necessarily make them worse, but probably at least continues them.
So you're saying the data isn't the problem. Yes.
Fixing the data doesn't fix the problem. How about that?
Yeah. Great. Okay, so the next question is from Jacob Joseph, and I think he's asking this broadly of the panel. There are also some advances using synthetic data now, so you can use machine learning to recreate a data set with similar or nearly identical features, but without using real data values. So you can share a data set publicly, that statistically resembles a confidential data set, but is completely fabricated. That was not a question. That was a statement. His question is, have others been using these yet? So I think the question is, are you familiar with synthetic data sets? And are you familiar with their use? I'm familiar, but what do you guys? Are you familiar on the panel with synthetic data sets?
Certainly in research, but not in education, not to publicly share as though it resembles the data.
Sorry, go ahead, Nancy.
No, I'm done.
We work with some companies that are in the process of, that are in this field of developing synthetic data. But in many cases, it's not something that's immediately going to be turned around and made public. It still does have a lot of potentially, there's a lot of synthetic data use being developed in financial services industry because of limitations that you by SEC and FICRA and other, but it's such a highly regulated area of what you can do with data. And in order to take advantage of some of the analysis capable with machine learning and various other systems, there's a lot of interest in synthetic data that represents the aggregate performance of that data set and provides that sort of insight for that industry. But that doesn't mean that they would want to make that synthetic data set public because it provides that sort of insight. That is part of the inherent value of it, is that it still represents at a large scale, a group scale, what their consumer attributes might be or are. So even though it can't be turned around into my personal data, it still reflects things that they may not want shared publicly. So I don't think just the idea that it's going to be a synthetic data set is going to automatically correlate to the fact that it could then be made public. There certainly could be synthetic data sets that could be made public for use, and that's part of the privacy enhancing technology strategies that many people are trying to develop and use as one of the ways, but there are still categories of that.
Yeah, just to add on to that a little bit, there is, so I think it's Pew that is working to create a location for developers to be able to pull synthetic data sets or anonymized data sets that have actually already been used to test machine learning algorithms, and they're releasing them under Creative Commons license. So not necessarily purely public, but as these data sets are created, researchers can check a box and allow for these data sets to be searchable under Creative Commons license, has been one approach to actually getting more data sets out there. And therefore doing it that way, it makes it non-attributable to like even the originator of the data set. So you're not worried about some of that profiling that has happened. Okay.
Natalie, there's a question in the chat that was sent in via email, so I want to make sure it gets asked to our panelists. What's the hardest part of getting two entities to agree on a plan for sharing data with each other? In my limited experience, it seems that secure handling of the data seems to be the toughest area to agree on. So question, what's the hardest part of getting two entities to agree on a plan for sharing their data?
I'll jump in and not disparage Brenda, but I think often getting the two legal departments to agree to sharing is tough.
Agree, and add on to that. So yes, the lawyers, but then also just like getting it to be in a place where it's not a transactional discussion. So recognizing that it's data that you need to collaborate around, so it needs to be made available. And so what do those agreements look like for the actual data sharing agreements beyond just creating transactional MOUs?
Mm-hmm.
There's a shared value piece of this that I think is really interesting. Oftentimes the hardest part is just getting two organizations with different motivations to agree that it makes sense to work together, and not just because you want their data, but because there's combinatorial value of actually bringing the two entities together and sharing. Any other thoughts?
I think I can speak to my experience at the City of LA. Shared agreement on like benefits is definitely a piece. I think there's also, just honestly speaking, a piece of a little bit of managing competition, mitigating competition, and being able to compromise in ways that may be a little bit uncomfortable or maybe contradictory to the vision that you have for the role that you play in being the owner of all of the data.
Very fair. All right, let's jump into the next question, which is, let's talk a little bit more about data standards. So digital identity is still an emerging area with innovation occurring at the federal, state, and local levels. A widely used online identity that can be used to access government services will require new policies and technical standards. So Brenda, what are some of the key policies that would need to be in place at a federal and state level to facilitate a single digital identity?
So I'm just making sure I'm unmuted here. So I think that kind of as I mentioned before, part of the problem or part of the challenge for this process is the provider, the like actual technological platform that's going to be used for this digital identity system. There's a commercial aspect of this. We're seeing competition developing already among providers of these digital wallets, where different authenticating agencies, from your local library to the DMV to some private organization, can be affiliated with that platform and provide that authentication when and where it's needed. And you as the user control whatever the access systems might be to that. But then there also could be, sort of a single service provider from the government, depending on how that ends up, or some combination thereof. And it's really, I think, unclear yet how that's going to work. But all of those are going to take, policy standards, industry standards, technical standards, both for interoperability and for security. And as I mentioned earlier, there are restrictions now in the government about the sharing of data across departments. And it's a pretty high level of approval that's required for like the Department of Labor to access your data from the Department of Education or from the IRS or something like that. And ultimately, I think that's what we want. We want that to not be easy to have that data be free flowing. And so those same kind of restrictions, if we do have a federal or a centralized identity system provided, we're going to have to really look at those sort of controls that we have now and see which ones need to be continued for that service and maybe made different. Or if we're collecting biometric information as part of that identity system, that needs to be stored separately from some of the other information. So there need to be security protocols. Some of the data is sensitive data that is held in different places, and that has different levels of protection. So all of those questions need to be asked in the framework of traditional privacy standards and practices, along with the security and technical protections that would be in place.
So as Steve from Tech Matters pointed out in the Q&A, this presupposes that we actually want a single digital identity. And I think we shouldn't have done that. I think that it's actually a worthy conversation to talk about what are the risks associated with single digital identities. We touched on it a little bit when bringing up the digital divide and equity and access. But let's talk a little bit about what does it look like in a world with a single digital identity? Who's at greatest risk if we go down that path? And what does it look like to do that or not do that? So it's almost like a pros and cons conversation. I saw Nancy shaking her head, so I think she has thoughts.
Not sure I have much to say, but just again, my example in education, connecting data preschool through K-12, through post-secondary into workforce. Do we have a unique one ID that follows through? What type of data are we sharing with the other agencies and then with researchers? I think I think in general, people are good with that. We can articulate the benefits of connecting the data and understanding the pipeline to improve outcomes. That's always my tagline. To get kids into and through college and making more than minimum wage and getting, good credentials and licensures and stuff like that. And so we need all of this analysis. But there's also going to be people who fear the tracking, if you use that word, of my kid all the way through and understanding. And then if you, in some of these systems, if you add in criminal justice or health and human services and the early labels or your misstep in 10th grade, is that going to follow you in this database down the line? I mean, honestly, there are people who resist contact tracing for COVID for privacy reasons. So getting to sensitive data like education or financial or whatever, I think we can make the case, but we also have to Taylor's point earlier, we have to listen to the concerns and, accept them, accommodate them, and figure out that's one of the other big things in all this big data and data use conversation for me is which user needs which data, when, and how frequently. What's going to be, aggregates at a state level versus individual analysis, and how's it going to be used, and who has access, and which third party. There's just so many nuances to this, and we tend to talk globally or overarching, and we need to have real specific conversations around some of this to mitigate concerns.
I think it's, I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth, so I may be overthinking the question here, but I think it's less about a single identifier and more a question of like a national identifier, like sort of a primary identifier, because in the US, this is sort of a very uncommon or uncomfortable concept for us. I don't know that we're ever really going to get to a point, or I don't foresee we're going to get to a point where we have a single identifier. I mean, there's too many subsets of systems that want to have their own little piece of the pie. Now, they may be managed similarly, like I said, in digital wallets. They may be interoperable. There may be, tech exchanges and things like that. But, if you kind of think back to the throwback days of, I don't know when, maybe the 90s or the early 2000s, when you might have had on your keychain like 15 different little member, VIP card type things from 7 different grocery stores and, 2 or 3 hardware stores and whatever else. And each one had their own. And I think there's always going to be an element of that in terms of there's going to be these little subsets of it, of ID. And even within schools, even within some of these, longer and potentially public engagements. But I think the question is, are we going to have a national ID, or are we going to have a single primary ID in some way? And that really is a question that's kind of unique to the US and also to an extent to the UK, because we're 2 of the very few countries that don't already have that. And how we shift to that, if we shift to that, what the implications of that are a conversation that is well developed in this country, and there's lots of positions on that in many places. But I think making it digital is a piece of it, and certainly adds concerns for people. But it's also part of that bigger question of just, do we even want that concept of a national ID? And if so, is it going to be digital, and then how's that going to work, and what are the protections and privacy and security that are going to go along with it? Maybe having it digitally is better in some people's minds than, not. But maybe for some people, it's still all just a bad thing to go down that path regardless.
And also, what are the implications of it, right? Because if we go down the path of a national ID, there are implications for people in this country who may not be happy with having a national ID, or that's just not, it actually makes it harder for them to access services if we go digital in that way. A city that I shall not name went this path of turning a government service purely digital, and they announced it, a lot of fanfare. People were so excited that they could go online and access this digital service, except for the people that didn't have quality internet service in their areas, or the digital version of it didn't fully address their needs. So it actually made it harder for some people to get service. And a lot of that was because in their conversations around designing the digital service, they didn't talk to all of the constituents or all the different types of constituents and take into account some of these implications of a fully digital government. So immediately off the top of my head, I think about things like digital divide and access to services and not harming that. What are some of the other implications of going to this fully digital world for our government services?
I think that there's a consideration around just the way that people access services in general, that a digital identity might be able to support. But I think there might be some other areas that deserve attention, and possibly even before a digital identity can be considered. A uniform, single national digital identity could be considered. And where my mind goes is thinking about people who, for example, enroll in safety net benefits, food assistance, housing assistance. There is a really interesting, complicated process to being able to not only enroll, but recertify year after year after year. That leaves a lot of people without. And I don't think it's a matter that a single digital identity would necessarily be able to solve. I think there are kind of tangential considerations to be made around how we manage our processes, just from like a operational point of view. What if a single identity does exist? How will our institutions and the people that work there completely shift the way that they do business, the way that the things that they are, tasked to do when they show up to work every day? How will that completely shift, and how might we accommodate that change management? And so I think that, I love all the innovations, and I love all the ideas. And I'm always going to be that person that's like, well, what is it going to actually take for us to get there? Like, logistically speaking, operationally speaking, and how much money is that going to cost? And how much training is that going to require? And who might get left out in that process, right? Like, I think there's also a really real challenge of people who work in government who are not the most technically savvy, who are being thrust into these new practices that require them to learn all of the things and know all of the things. And it's really overwhelming, and it's overwhelming for me. So I imagine that it would be overwhelming for someone who's like, I don't really do this tech stuff. And, thinking about the possibilities holistically comes with consideration for how we might change those behaviors, not only on the recipient end, not only on the creator end, but on the administrator, facilitator side as well.
Yeah, I think those are absolutely all the right questions to ask. I think, to put it in context, again, it's that question of the national ID, if whether or not it's digital, that engenders those questions. Because like right now we have the Real ID Act, which has been, a full implementation of it has been delayed like several different times for 5 years at a time or something. I mean, it passed in like the early 2000s or something, and it's still not fully in effect, and I think isn't going to be fully in effect for another couple of years. But it's finally almost at that point where it's really, no kidding, going to be required to have what's called a Real ID to enter a federal building, to access federal benefits with that, using that as your ID, or to fly. And so that de facto is going to be the ID you have to have for a lot of things that you take for granted your ability to do, either that or a passport, which is, essentially the only alternative at that point. So it's still issued by states, and the requirements to actually get one are very extreme. You have to go in person to the DMV. I don't know what they're doing right now with COVID, but at least over the last several years, you have to go in person to the DMV, and you have to have about 7 pieces of documentation with you. And if you don't have them, or some of the allowable alternatives, and it's things like, a mortgage statement, a utility bill, your social security card, your birth certificate, your passport if you have one. There are many, many people that don't have these, don't have any of these, or some of these, or some significant portion of these. So it's already a tremendous administrative hurdle to get this. And then, what you can do with the ID, or how challenged it will be, or things like that. So those processes are already, I think, need to be questioned along all of the things that Taylor just brought up, in terms of who's impacting, who's being left behind, how is this creating gaps in accessibility for different people. And then when you put that digitally, those same questions follow. Maybe it makes it easier in some cases. Maybe connecting it to some other kind of identification or biometric or something makes it more possible, or less friction in that process to get it. Maybe if we get to some point where we have those IDs, they actually improve some kinds of things. So when you think about registration, voting registration, and the ID requirement to show up and vote, maybe if states couldn't make it so hard for people to get an ID to register to vote, maybe we could actually make that process better by having the ID issued by a different entity than the one operating the poll. So all of that is, things that have to be taken into consideration as those processes are put in place. But they are part of sort of the underlying system of disenfranchisement, not literally just for voting, but in engagement generally for large parts of the population.
Excellent points. We've got 4 minutes left. Do we want to do a quick round of final thoughts and then wrap up? We can start with Nancy, since we started with Brenda last time.
This has been awesome. Thank you for facilitating this. My plea is for good data governance programs and to be proactive. And to me, that includes, it's not just the policy and practice or the documentation. It has to include training. It has to include looking at contracts with third-party vendors around privacy, confidentiality, security. Through technology, we have automated safeguards we can use. We need clear policies, but really big, and we forget this a lot, is transparency. Put it on the web, on your website. What are your practices? And then the other thing that rarely gets talked about are what are the consequences for breaking the policy, especially third-party vendors or researchers. You have to have consequences, and you have to actually administer the consequences or apply the consequences for people to have trust.
Thank you, Nancy. Taylor?
Yeah, thank you so much, Natalie, Nancy, and Brenda. It's been awesome just to sit with you and learn so much. So thank you. I think my final thought is that I believe in government. I believe in public service. And I believe that conversations like these are what'll get us there. And it's an iterative process. It's an iterative process. And the more we discuss and listen and tinker, the better we'll be. And I appreciate you framing it around the vision, Natalie, because I think that a strong vision is what will ultimately be what we can design together.
Thank you. Brenda?
Echo totally the thanks to everybody for being here today, and to the participant or the attendees for the great questions. Really appreciate the engagement on that. On the Zoom webinars, it's so hard sometimes to know what's happening out there. So it's nice that people were really engaged with that. I guess my final thoughts are that, the technology doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's not coming down to us. It's not doing something to us. Like we already operate, we're already humans interacting with humans. The technology is built by humans, it's implemented by humans. And at the end of the day, as customers or consumers of it or recipients of the benefits of it, we're humans. And if we kind of can keep focus on that and on our values, the underlying things that we actually want to protect, whatever the freedoms are, individual autonomy, those kinds of things, and view the technology through the spectrum of how does it make us do that better and where do we need to prevent it or control it from making those things worse. I think we have a great deal more likelihood of success than if we just sort of get caught up in we can do all these things, let's do all these things. Oh, and maybe if there's some bad side effects, oh, well, too bad, we just have to live with those or something. So I see too often, or it feels like I see too often, that everything is about the technology. And if we can just get the technology just right, then everything will be fine. And I think that we need to have a different perspective than that to really succeed.
Thank you, Brenda. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Taylor. This hour and a half went by so quickly. Lots of good thoughts, lots of great conversations, lots of notes of things I'm going to follow up on. And everybody for listening, thank you. Hope you have a good half day, good Tech Fest, and whatever else is happening throughout this week. Think about governance and just remember that it's about the people. The data and the tech will happen, but only if the people know what to do with it. All right, I think I'll close with that. Continue the conversation in the Slack community, and there's also a ton of resources available on a Bright Hive page around data governance. And you can also find all 4 of us on LinkedIn and various other social media places. So talk to everybody soon. Bye.